There was nothing unusual about the quiet Primrose Street. Most of the houses here were neat, with manicured lawns and bright windows that hid well-off families. It was a typical suburban neighborhood, where life flowed smoothly and calmly, and neighbors were used to exchanging greetings in the morning and small pleasantries. Everyone knew each other, or at least thought they did. But it is precisely in this place, where routine and the appearance of calm rule, that surprises are especially disturbing to the minds. Late in the evening, when almost all the windows in the houses were already out, and the street was shrouded in night silence, a figure appeared in the dark alley. It was a young man, his steps quick and precise, as if he was used to long walks alone. But the man wasn't a random passerby, it was Samuel Jackson, a 25-year-old who had been living in the area for several years with his ailing mother. Today was one of those days when he came home from a long shift at the hospital where he worked as a junior nurse. Tired but happy that he had been able to help several patients, all he wanted to do was go home and get some rest. Samuel was a tall, slender guy with short black hair and friendly eyes. He was strong in spirit, although life did not spare him. His mother was seriously ill, and every day he helped her cope with the illness. Despite his fatigue from work, Samuel always found the strength to take care of her. This long walk home, usually in silence, was a time of reflection for him. He thought about how he could improve her care, his plans for the future, and how he could deal with everyday difficulties. Samuel was focused on his goal of providing his mother with everything she needed. So what happens next? Why did this day become so fateful? Find out in the following chapters, and if this story has captured your attention, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the sequel. Leave your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if you were in Samuel's shoes? But tonight was different. He felt someone's eyes on him, and it made him slightly uneasy. A thought flashed through his mind: was someone watching him? Perhaps it was just that the neighbors had returned home and caught a glimpse of him in the dark. He decided not to think too much of it and quickened his pace, heading for the house, wanting to be safe as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, across the street, Mr. Baker was sitting at the window of his house. He was one of those neighbors who can be called guardians of the neighborhood. Mr. Baker, an elderly man with a strong sense of order, spent his evenings observing what was going on outside, always trying to maintain safety. When someone strange or suspicious appeared on the street, he immediately felt obligated to report it to the authorities. And today, as Samuel walked past his window, Mr. Baker felt a familiar sense of unease. He was convinced that he knew all his neighbors by sight, and this young man coming home late at night looked strange to him. Who is he? What does he want here at this time? Mr. Baker thought, his heart beating faster, and his hand automatically reached for the phone. Without hesitation, Mr. Baker dialed the police number. The voice on the other end of the line was calm and professional, but Mr. Baker's anxious imagination was already conjuring up dark scenarios. There is a suspicious person on Primrose Street. I think he's sneaking into someone's house. Please send a patrol, he said quickly, adding as much conviction as possible to his voice. He was confident that he was doing the right thing, because safety was paramount. Mr. Baker felt like a hero, a defender of his neighborhood. In his mind, this was not just a call, but an important action aimed at protecting his home and neighbors. He looked anxiously at the darkening street and waited for the police to arrive. His suspicions seemed so justified that he didn't even ask himself if Samuel was really what they thought he was. Meanwhile, Samuel was approaching his house when he heard a familiar sound, the sirens of a police car. He was surprised, not understanding what was going on. My heart sank with a sense of foreboding. Could there have been an incident in the area? A thought crossed my mind. But when a police car pulled up right in front of his driveway, it became clear that this wasn't an accident. The police were obviously here because of him. The two officers got out of the car, quickly scanning the street. They headed straight for Samuel, their faces serious and their steps brisk. Samuel felt a growing sense of unease inside him, even though he didn't know what exactly he had done wrong. He had seen these officers on the street before, but had never had any problems with them. He was sure that everyone in the area knew him, or at least that's what he thought. "Good evening. Where were you this evening?" one of the officers asked in a stern tone, as if waiting for Samuel to do something suspicious. Samuel, puzzled and a little dazed, answered, "I just got back from work. I live here." He pointed to the house where he lived with his mother, but the police continued to stare at him in disbelief. "We have received a report of a suspicious person on this street." "You fit the description," the officer continued, his voice filled with hidden suspicion. Samuel felt his stomach tighten. What's happening? Why is he, a local resident, suddenly considered suspicious? A few minutes ago, he just wanted to get home and rest, and now he is standing in front of the police, who are clearly looking for a reason to detain. A police car parked with its lights flashing in the middle of a dark street caught the attention of several neighbors. People began to come out of their homes and quietly watch what was happening. Among them was Mr. Baker, who was standing on his porch with a satisfied expression on his face. He felt like a winner. In his eyes, the situation was developing as he expected. He was sure he did the right thing when he called the police. But something told Samuel that the situation might not end as his neighbor had planned. Samuel Jackson, a young man of 25, was a man who was toughened by life from an early age. Tall and athletic, he looked older than his years because of the expression on his face, something between fatigue and an inner world full of responsibilities and obligations. He had dark hair cut short, and expressive brown eyes that reflected a mixture of determination and wisdom that was not typical of his age. Born into a working-class family, Samuel learned the values that shaped his character from childhood. His father was a mechanic, a man who worked from dawn to dusk, trying to provide his family with everything they needed. Samuel's father had always taught him that work was the main road to success, and that no matter how hard times were, you couldn't give up. "Never give up, son," he said. "There are many challenges in life, but the main thing is to stay honest and hardworking, no matter what." These words became Samuel's life motto. His mother, a strong and kind woman, was a teacher at the local school, but when Samuel turned 18, she fell seriously ill. The disease began to progress rapidly, and she had to leave her job. In that moment, Samuel knew that the life he was prepared for would change forever. He was the eldest child in the family, and the responsibility for his mother fell on his shoulders. Samuel's younger sister, Kim, was still in high school at the time, and he knew that her future depended on how he handled the challenges. Samuel was an ambitious young man. He graduated from high school with honors and was about to go to university to study medicine. But his mother's illness changed his plans. Instead of leaving home to go to school, he decided to stay close to his family. He chose a profession that would allow him not only to earn a living, but also to help people. He became a nurse. Working at the hospital became not just a means of living for Samuel, but also his life's work. He was always attentive to his patients, trying to make their lives as easy as possible. His colleagues respected him for his hard work and calmness in difficult situations. Patients, especially the elderly, saw in him not just a nurse, but a person who cares for them sincerely, with warmth and compassion. Samuel spent every day working at the hospital, helping other people cope with their illnesses, but in the evenings he returned home to take care of his mother. The disease was progressing, and she needed constant care. He learned to give her injections, prepare a special diet, and monitor her condition. Although it was hard physically and emotionally, Samuel never complained. He knew he had to be strong, not just for his mother, but for the little sister who relied on him. Kim's younger sister was like a light in the dark for Samuel. Despite her own difficulties, she always supported her brother. She saw him working on two fronts in the hospital and at home, and tried to help as much as she could. Kim was a creative person. She loved to draw, dreamed of becoming a designer and going to study in a big city. Samuel knew it was his duty to help her achieve that dream. He saved money from every paycheck so that someday he could send her to college. Samuel's inner world was full of responsibilities and debts. He lived for others, for his mother, for his sister, for his patients. It didn't leave him much time for himself. His days were timed to the minute, and his nights often turned into moments of deep reflection. Sometimes, when he came home from a long shift, he would sit in the kitchen with a cup of tea and think about what might have happened if life had been different. But there was no bitterness or regret in these thoughts, just a calm acceptance that he needed to move on, overcoming the difficulties on his way. Samuel had one weak spot, his old bike, which he rode to work. This bike, inherited from his father, was a symbol of his childhood and those times when everything seemed easier. As a teenager, he often rode it around the neighborhood, and every time he got on the bike, he felt closer to his father, who had long since left this world. Despite the worn wheels and scratched frame, this bike was more than just a vehicle for him. It was a symbol of his resilience and dedication to his roots. However, not all the neighbors knew him as well as they might have. Some people, like Mr. Baker, saw him only as a black young man who came home late. They didn't know about his life, his responsibilities, his work. They saw only the outer shell and made their judgments based on their own biases. It was a painful reminder to Samuel that even when you work and sacrifice for others, there may still be those who will judge you by your appearance. Mr. Baker, an elderly neighbor Samuel barely knew, had lived across the street from his house for several years. Baker was an old-school man who thought he knew everyone and everything in his neighborhood. He looked at Samuel suspiciously, especially when he came home late at night. Mr. Baker was used to thinking that young men like Samuel could be a source of trouble, though he never bothered to get to know him better. On the rare occasions when Mr. Baker and Samuel crossed paths on the street, their eyes met, but not a word was said. Baker's eyes were always wary, as if he expected something unkind from the young man. Samuel knew that his neighbor was suspicious of him, but he never tried to talk to him or explain who he was. For Samuel, it was part of life. He knew that some people wouldn't change their minds even if they had facts to refute their preconceived notions. Samuel tried not to dwell on it. His main concern was his mother and sister, as well as the patients he met at the hospital every day. He was a man of action, not talk, and preferred to prove his worth through actions rather than words. He knew that his work was important, and that every day of it was helping someone to live a better life. But at times like this, when he saw someone like Mr. Baker think he was an outsider, he still couldn't help but feel a little sad. Samuel was sure that if people really got to know him, they would see him as someone who cares about others, who gives his all for the well-being of his family and those in need. But in a world where external judgments sometimes outweigh real actions, Samuel had to live with the understanding that not everyone was ready to see him for real. With each passing day, his confidence only grew stronger. He knew that the main thing was to keep moving forward, regardless of the difficulties and prejudices of others. Although he was prepared for the fact that not everyone would understand him, he remained true to his values and principles. Samuel was a man who put caring for others first, and he knew that was his real strength. The night in Primrose Street was still calm and peaceful. The air was filled with the usual stillness of the area. Most of the residents had already gone to their homes, and the city was sinking into sleep. The street was lit only by dim street lamps, which seemed unable to dispel the darkness completely. Samuel strode down the sidewalk to his house, enjoying the rare moments of calm that came after a long day's work. At that moment, he didn't know that just around the corner, someone had already taken him for a threat. Mr. Baker, standing at the window of his house, saw Samuel pass along the street. His eyes narrowed in suspicion. The late evening, the unfamiliar silhouette, the rapid pace, all of this immediately made him uneasy. Mr. Baker was convinced that he knew everyone in the area, and here was a man he had barely seen during the day. As soon as he heard the footsteps, his imagination conjured up a picture of menace. What is this person doing here at this time of night? He thought. Baker had always been a cautious man, sometimes even overly wary. Having lived in this area for many years, he felt like a kind of watchman on his street, and more than once drew attention to the suspicious behavior of people he did not know. The neighbors were used to his vigilance and took it as part of his character. He considered it his duty to protect his home and those around him from any possible danger, even if it meant jumping to conclusions. And tonight, Baker was sure he was doing the right thing. Samuel, meanwhile, walked slowly to his front door. His mind was far away from any problems. He was already imagining going into a warm house, having a cup of tea, and checking on his mother. He was about to put the key in the door when there was a sound behind him, something Samuel hadn't expected to hear so late in the night. It was the familiar sound of a police car's siren as it came to a sharp stop at the curb. Samuel turned around and saw the car stop just a few meters away from him. Two policemen got out, their faces focused and tense, like people who have arrived on an important mission. One of them said something to his partner, and they began to approach Samuel at a brisk pace. He froze in place, feeling his heart start to beat faster. He didn't know what was going on, but the whole situation looked like he was the target of this visit. "Good evening," one of the policemen broke the silence, moving closer to Samuel. His voice was stern, and there was a hint of suspicion in it. Samuel felt his palms sweat with nervousness. Why did they stop him? What do they want? "We've received a report of a suspicious person on this street," the cop continued, scanning Samuel from head to toe. "Can you explain what you're doing here?" Samuel froze. The policeman's words were like an unexpected blow. He couldn't believe that right now, in front of his own house, he was being accused of looking suspicious. But he quickly regained his composure, trying to keep his voice as calm as possible. "I just got back from work." He pointed to the door behind him, which he was about to enter when he stopped because of the police. The officers exchanged glances. One of them, a senior officer, nodded to his partner, as if agreeing that further investigation was needed. "Can you show me your ID card?" the policeman asked, clearly not going to let Samuel go so easily. Samuel slowly reached for his wallet. He knew better than to make any sudden moves in such situations, because every second could lead to further escalation. Thoughts flashed through my head. Why is this happening? Why was I stopped? He was absolutely certain that he hadn't done anything illegal, but the situation was escalating. He pulled out his ID card and handed it to the officer, trying to remain calm. The policeman took the document and studied it carefully, but there was no sign of relief on his face. Instead, he continued to stare at Samuel with the same suspicion that had been there from the beginning. "You said you live here?" the officer continued, as if trying to find a discrepancy in Samuel's words. "I haven't seen you here before." Samuel could barely contain his emotions. He was beginning to realize that the reason the cops were here was because they weren't just patrolling normally. Someone had clearly summoned them, and the reason for that was completely unfounded. But he couldn't immediately figure out who it was. Neighbors began to gather around. Mrs. Jones, an elderly woman who lived in the house across the street, looked out of the window when she saw the police flashing lights. Her face was full of worry, but she still didn't understand what was going on. Other neighbors started to come closer, observing the situation, but no one dared to intervene. "Well, sir, we got a call about a suspicious person, and you fit that description," the cop repeated, clutching Samuel's ID in his hands. These words made the guy freeze in place. Fit the description, these words sounded like a sentence. Samuel had never considered being accused of anything just because he was walking home, but now it was happening right in front of his eyes. Meanwhile, Mr. Baker was standing at the window of his house, watching what was happening. He felt triumphant. In his eyes, he did everything right. He noticed a suspicious person, called the police, and now they are dealing with the situation. His gaze was full of satisfaction, as if he expected an arrest to happen soon. Mr. Baker was sure that he was right and didn't even think that this young man was just a neighbor who had returned home after a hard day. To him, Samuel was an outsider, and his actions seemed to justify that opinion. Samuel stared at the cops, feeling a surge of anger and despair build inside him. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but it didn't mean anything right now. All that mattered was the officer's suspicions and the fact that his appearance fits the description. It was the moment when he realized the unfairness of what was happening. But despite his growing emotions, Samuel knew he couldn't afford to lose control. In such situations, any sudden movement or word could lead to a worse outcome. He knew that he would have to prove his innocence, and that simply declaring that he lived here might not be enough. The police continued to stare at him, clearly not intending to leave until the situation was finally clarified. Samuel already felt that he was being wrongly accused, and nothing he said would change their bias. His patience was wearing thin by the minute, but he knew he had to keep his cool. At the other end of the street, the bright lights of the houses where families were sleeping seemed so far away. Samuel felt as if he were standing alone on this street, surrounded by suspicion and distrust, as if the world itself was against him. What he didn't know was that the situation was about to take an unexpected turn, and this evening would change not only his life, but the attitude of everyone around him. This chapter shows the gradual build-up of conflict and the sense of injustice that grips Samuel. With each passing moment, the situation escalates, setting the stage for the climax that will soon occur. Samuel stood in front of the police on the dark street, feeling the invisible walls narrow around him. The air became thick, as if the atmosphere itself was pressing down on him. Every second seemed endless, and with each passing minute, he realized the absurdity of the situation. The whole thing seemed so absurd that for a moment he felt like a stranger in his own life. He, a man who had devoted his entire life to caring for others, who worked tirelessly to provide for his family, was now an object of suspicion just because someone in the area saw him as a threat. The policemen in front of him looked at him with a cold expression, as if they were assessing his every step, every movement. One of them, the senior officer, still held Samuel's ID card in his hands and occasionally glanced at it quickly, as if suspecting that the document might be a fake. The second policeman was standing a little behind, arms crossed, his gaze even more wary and biased. Samuel, who always tried to avoid conflict, felt a storm of emotions building up inside him at this moment. He knew very well that he hadn't done anything wrong, but right now, his words and actions didn't seem to matter. All his years of work, dedication, and sacrifice for his family were worthless in the face of those who saw him only as a suspicious black man on the street. "Look, I already told you, this is my home," Samuel repeated, trying to keep his voice calm but tense. "I just got back from work. I work in a hospital." He slowly reached into his pocket to pull out his hospital employee pass, once again trying to prove his innocence. The cop holding his ID nodded, gesturing for his partner to be ready if anything went wrong. It was a gesture that Samuel could see, and he saw in it the distrust and suspicion that had long been a part of his life when it came to dealing with law enforcement. "We got a call, sir," the cop repeated, studying the pass Samuel had given him. "We were informed that a suspicious person was seen on the street. We have to check everything out to the end." The words hit Samuel like a blow again. A suspicious person. Suspicious simply because he was where he had every right to be. Just because someone, probably his neighbor, Mr. Baker, thought he was dangerous just because of his appearance. It was like an endless cycle of bias that couldn't be broken. Samuel knew that this situation could easily escalate into something more serious, and the thought nagged at him. "Mr. Jackson," the officer said, handing the documents back to Samuel but not backing down, "you must understand that we must follow instructions. If you really live here, it should be easy to clear up. But if we have any doubts, we will have to detain you until the circumstances are clarified." These words made Samuel feel even more alienated. Despite all his attempts to explain his innocence, despite the fact that he provided all the necessary documents, he was still considered a threat. At that moment, he felt like he was trapped with no way out, it seemed. Meanwhile, the neighbors continued to go outside, attracted by the flashing lights of the police car. People were talking quietly among themselves, trying to understand what was going on. Some took pictures on their phones, others just stood on the sidelines, watching with curiosity and fear. Mrs. Jones, who had known Samuel since childhood and lived across the street, looked out of the window with a worried expression on her face. She'd seen Samuel helping her with her shopping, smiling as he greeted her at the door, and now she couldn't believe the cops had stopped him. But most disturbing of all was the look in Mr. Baker's eyes as he stood on the porch of his house, hands in his pockets, watching. He felt satisfied. He was sure that he made the right call to the police, which saves the area from the threat. To him, Samuel wasn't a man with a name and a history, he was just a suspicious young man who Baker didn't think should be on this street at this late hour. Samuel, noticing Mr. Baker's look, suddenly realized who it was that had called the police. This man, whom he rarely crossed paths with, this neighbor who always looked at him with suspicion, was the reason why he was now standing on his doorstep, surrounded by policemen. A wave of anger rose up inside Samuel again, but he held it back, knowing that any sudden movement could be misinterpreted. The police were clearly not going to leave. The senior officer who had been holding Samuel's papers all this time looked at him again, as if debating whether to continue questioning him. He knew that the situation was becoming tense, and that each next step could lead to further complications. Even so, his professional duty to follow protocol prevented him from simply letting Samuel go. As the situation escalated, Samuel felt his patience begin to run out. He knew that any action he took could be misinterpreted, but the anger, frustration, and weariness of being constantly viewed with preconceived notions made it hard for him to hold back. He took a deep breath. "I've told you everything I can. I showed you my documents. What else do you want? I live here. This is my home. Are you going to arrest me just for going home?" The police officer, who had remained calm until now, suddenly felt that the situation was getting out of hand. He didn't want to provoke a conflict, but he also didn't want to back down until he was sure everything was under control. "We're not going to arrest you, Mr. Jackson," the officer began, trying to calm the situation, but Samuel wasn't convinced. "We just need to make sure that you don't pose a threat." The words "threatening" made Samuel feel like a stranger in his own home again. He couldn't believe that he, a man who worked every day to take care of others, was now being accused of being dangerous. He wasn't just upset, he was insulted. At this moment, there was a commotion in the crowd gathered around. Someone came closer. It was Mrs. Ellis, an elderly woman who lived 2 doors down from Samuel. Slowly, with a cane in her hand, she approached the policeman. Her white hair was neatly tied up in a bun, and although her steps were slow and careful, there was determination in her eyes. "What's going on here?" Mrs. Ellis asked loudly, drawing attention to herself. The policeman turned, surprised by her presence. "This young man is Samuel. He's my neighbor. He helps me when I feel bad. He lives here. What the hell are you guys doing?" Her voice was loud and confident. Mrs. Ellis's words broke the tense silence that hung over the street. The policemen looked at each other, clearly embarrassed. They had to stop to reconsider their actions. "He saved me," Mrs. Ellis continued, now looking directly at the 2 policemen. "I once fainted in my garden. He was the one who saw me and called the ambulance. I owe him my life. And now you're stopping him like he's a criminal? What kind of madness is this?" Mrs. Ellis's words resonated in the crowd, and gradually the neighbors began to talk among themselves. Everyone knew that Samuel was a man who always helped, always ready to lend a shoulder in a difficult moment. The police, clearly not expecting this turn of events, froze, realizing that the situation was turning against them. Samuel stood off to one side, startled by Mrs. Ellis's words. He never considered his actions anything special, he just did what he thought was right. But in that moment, he realized that his actions really meant something to the people around him. Mr. Baker, standing on the porch of his house, suddenly felt his sense of triumph evaporate. He hadn't expected this turn of events. He thought he did everything right, that he was protecting his neighborhood from a suspicious person. But now that his neighbor had started talking about Samuel as a hero, his confidence was shaken. He looked at the crowd, at Samuel, and suddenly realized that his actions might have been hasty. The 2 policemen exchanged glances, and the senior officer finally made up his mind. He stepped forward and handed the ID card back to Samuel, saying, "Sorry for the misunderstanding, Mr. Jackson. We just followed the call. It looks like everything is fine. Have a nice evening." Samuel picked up his ID, but instead of just walking away in silence, he looked at the police and at Mr. Baker. His voice was low but firm, "Never judge a person by their appearance again. You don't know who he really is." These words hung in the air, making everyone think. Samuel's words, spoken with quiet but firm certainty, seemed to hang in the air, seeping into the minds of everyone present. Primrose Street was silent for a moment after he returned his ID and addressed the police. For everyone present, these words were more than just a remark, they were a call to reflect, a call to understand and reevaluate what had just happened. The people on both sides of the sidewalk were looking at Samuel with a different expression in their eyes. Samuel was always a calm and reasonable man who didn't seek confrontation and preferred to solve problems in a peaceful way. He never considered himself a hero, but in that moment, he felt the power of his words and realized that sometimes one simple statement can make people see the world differently. However, he didn't expect that his statement would be the catalyst for the deeper change that was about to happen. The police officers to whom he had just returned his documents froze for a moment, and then the older one nodded softly. "We understand, Mr. Jackson." "Sorry for the misunderstanding," he said, more politely now. There was no longer the stern wariness in his voice that had accompanied their conversation in the beginning. He turned to his partner, and the two of them exchanged a quick glance as they began to back away toward their patrol car. Obviously, the situation was over for them. Samuel watched the police officers slowly walk away, and despite his relief that the tension had eased, there was still a sense of injustice inside him. But the most unexpected thing happened right after the patrol car disappeared around the bend. Mrs. Ellis, who had come to Samuel's defense and had been instrumental in exposing the absurdity of the situation, stepped closer to him. Her eyes shone with sincere gratitude and pride. "You're a real hero, Samuel," she said, putting her hand on his shoulder. "I'll never forget what you did for me back then. If it wasn't for you, who knows what might have happened to me?" Samuel just nodded modestly, not wanting to draw attention to what he was doing. It was natural for him to help those who needed it. But his inner tension, caused by the injustice of the last few minutes, still remained. He couldn't understand why, despite everything he did for his community, he was still judged on his appearance, on the preconceived notions that were so deeply ingrained in some people. At this time, the crowd that had been watching the entire situation began to move and discuss what had happened. People were talking among themselves, and the tone of their voices changed. If at first they had looked at Samuel with suspicion and curiosity, now the faces of the neighbors were filled with mixed emotions, shame for jumping to conclusions and respect for his steadfastness. But the most unexpected twist was Mr. Baker's reaction. Standing on his porch, he watched the scene unfold, and the confidence with which he had called the police was now gone. At first, he was convinced that he was right. "I'm protecting our neighborhood from potential threats," he thought, fully confident that he was acting as a prudent citizen. But after Mrs. Ellis sided with Samuel and claimed that this young man had saved her life, his confidence began to waver. Baker looked at the crowd, then at Samuel, who was standing in a circle of people, holding back his emotions, and realized that his actions were not only hasty, but also wrong. He called the police not because he saw a real threat, but because he saw a young black man on the street, where, in his opinion, such a person does not belong at such a late hour. Deep down, he knew that what he was doing was based on biases and stereotypes that he might never have openly admitted to himself. Mr. Baker walked slowly off the porch, his hands shaking, and he could clearly feel the disapproving stares of the other neighbors. He walked over to Samuel, stopping a short distance away. For a few moments there was a silence that seemed endless. Everyone present, including Samuel, turned their attention to Mr. Baker, waiting for his next move. He steeled himself, his face showing confusion, and finally spoke. "Samuel Dash," he began, his voice shaky and nervous. He didn't know how to properly express his thoughts. I didn't want to. I didn't want it to go that far." Samuel just stood there, looking at Baker. He knew that his neighbor was trying to apologize, but he wasn't sure if the words would change anything in his heart. Over the years, Samuel had grown accustomed to the bias that was evident in people like Baker, and he knew that sometimes it took people a long time to understand their mistakes. "I made a mistake," Baker continued, trying to find the right words. "I misjudged you. I thought you were a danger. I called the police because I was sure you didn't belong here. But now I see that I was wrong." The crowd around them watched in silence. People had stopped talking to each other and were now waiting to see how Samuel would react. Mr. Baker was clearly trying to correct his mistake, but his words sounded too weak compared to the damage his actions might have done. Samuel stared at Baker, his mind racing. He felt angry and disappointed that this man, whom he thought was his neighbor, had called the police on the basis of just a biased perception. Even so, Samuel knew that Baker wasn't the only one who thought that way. His bias was only part of a larger problem that Samuel had faced all his life. But he also knew that any step toward reconciliation was important. Even if Baker only realized his mistake after Mrs. Ellis intervened, it was already a step forward. After a brief pause, Samuel took a deep breath and finally spoke. "Mr. Baker, I appreciate what you said," he began, his voice calm, though his emotions were still seething inside. "But you must understand that your actions could have led to much more serious consequences. I'm not just a person who can be accused of something without reason. I live here, I work, I take care of my family, just like any other person on this street. Your biased judgments are what really pose a danger, not to me, but to our society." Samuel's words were simple, but they carried a powerful message. Baker realized that his apology, while important, could not instantly undo the damage that had already been done by his actions. He felt the eyes of his neighbors, who might have shared his bias, but were now ashamed of it. It was hard for him to admit his mistakes, but it was the only way to start the reconciliation process. "I understand, Samuel," Baker managed to say. "I never thought that my judgment could be like this, biased. I only wanted to protect my home, but I didn't think about how that might affect you. I promise that I will think differently in the future." Samuel nodded, accepting Mr. Baker's words, but his expression remained serious. He couldn't just forgive and forget, but he was willing to give his neighbor a chance to make amends. "I hope you really change your attitude," Samuel said, looking Baker straight in the eye. "Not just to me, but to all the people you meet. We all deserve to be judged on what we do, not what we look like." Mr. Baker, hearing these words, looked confused and deep in thought. He nodded in agreement, then turned around a little awkwardly and walked back to his house. For him, this day was the beginning of a long journey to rethink his own beliefs and biases. Samuel watched Baker go back to his room and felt a little relieved, but he also knew that this was only a small step on the road to real change in society. Despite everything that had happened, he knew that he had done everything possible to ensure that this situation ended peacefully. The neighbors around him began to disperse. Some gave him a quiet nod of respect, others stopped to thank him for his self-control and steadfastness. Samuel didn't think of himself as a hero, but he knew that his actions that night might have changed the perception of many people. Samuel stood in Primrose Street, watching the neighbors slowly leave for their homes. After an emotional conversation with Mr. Baker, the tension that had been hanging in the air all evening finally began to ease. The street was quiet again, but to Samuel it wasn't as peaceful as it used to be. This evening has left a mark on his soul that is not so easily forgotten. After Mr. Baker's apology, Samuel felt a little relieved, but it was only a partial satisfaction. Despite his neighbor's sincere words, Samuel knew that correcting the stereotypes and biases that were deeply ingrained in society was not a matter of one conversation. What was important, however, was that this evening was a step in the right direction. He understood that sometimes change begins with the realization of a mistake, even if that realization comes too late. Mrs. Ellis, the elderly neighbor who had stood up for him, was still standing nearby. Her eyes shone with kindness, and she smiled cautiously at Samuel. "You deserve more than just an apology," she said softly, her voice full of gratitude and respect. "I know it's been a tough day for you, but you did well." Samuel nodded modestly, feeling a small wave of gratitude for her support. He knew that if it hadn't been for her intervention, the situation might have ended differently. She became the person who helped expose the absurdity of what was happening and return the situation to a reasonable course. Her words had really changed the course of events, and Samuel was grateful for that. Mrs. Ellis took Samuel's hand and added, "I know this may be hard for you to admit, but sometimes these moments open people's eyes. Perhaps this evening will make Mr. Baker and the others think about their actions." Samuel nodded again, knowing she was right. Perhaps this evening will be the beginning of a change for some people. He never aspired to be an example or a hero, but if his actions could make someone think and change their views, that was already an achievement. However, in his heart of hearts, he knew that one victory didn't mean the fight was over. There were many more moments ahead of him when he would have to face injustice. Mrs. Ellis shook his hand and slowly began to walk away, heading for her house. "If you ever need help, you know where to find me," she said, smiling. Samuel watched her go, feeling a little relieved to know that there were people who genuinely supported him. When the street was empty again, Samuel was left alone on his doorstep. Just a few minutes ago, he'd been surrounded by police officers and the disapproving stares of his neighbors, but now everything seemed peaceful again. However, the world around him was deceptive. He knew that change didn't come overnight. But today, he took a small step towards making people see him not as a threat, but as a person. Samuel took his keys out of his pocket and finally opened the door of his house. As he stepped inside, the quiet light in the living room greeted him, and the sense of home that he had been waiting for so long gradually began to return. His mother, whom he had so carefully protected and nursed, was already asleep. Samuel walked over to her room, looked at her through the half-open door, and breathed a sigh of relief. It was his place of strength, his home, where he was safe, where he was just Samuel, a son, a brother, and a man who cares about his family. His thoughts drifted back to what had happened on the street. He knew that such cases were not uncommon and that his life, like the lives of many others, was constantly threatened by unfair accusations and bias. But he also understood that every such situation is a chance for society to reflect and change. This evening, he saw that people have the ability to recognize their mistakes, even if that realization comes late. Sitting in the quiet of his home, Samuel felt tired, not just physically, but mentally. He was tired of constantly fighting prejudice and injustice, but at the same time, a sense of confidence was growing inside him. This evening showed him that despite the difficulties, his perseverance and willingness to defend his rights can give results. The next day, Samuel knew that life would return to normal. He will go back to work, help people again, take care of his mother and meet neighbors on the street. But now he knew that his neighbors would look at him differently. Mr. Baker, who called the police, may begin to see him not just as a suspicious man, but as someone who lives nearby and deserves respect. Samuel wasn't sure if Baker would completely change his mind, but even a small step toward understanding was already important. The night ended peacefully, but for Samuel it was only one battle in a long struggle for justice. He knew that there would be many more moments ahead where he would have to deal with bias and distrust, but now he felt stronger. He wasn't alone. He had people behind him who supported him, like Mrs. Ellis, and every day was a chance to make the world a little better. Closing the door behind him and turning out the lights, Samuel went to bed, knowing that this evening was an important lesson for everyone on Primrose Street. This incident did not pass without a trace, and its consequences will be felt for a long time. Primrose Street was once again surrounded by the quiet that its residents valued so much. House after house flickered with window lights, and life returned to normal. But for Samuel Jackson, this evening will never be like the rest. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, looking thoughtfully out the dark window. The events of the past day were like a whirlwind that left a deep impression on his soul. Samuel had always been a man who believed in justice and the best in people, but this evening had shown him that even the simplest actions could cause distrust and fear in others. The police officers who responded to Mr. Baker's call were only part of the problem that not only Samuel faced every day, but also many people who were viewed through the lens of prejudice. Biased judgments that seemed justified to Baker could easily turn a peaceful situation into a dangerous and tense one. However, despite all the difficulties, Samuel felt that this situation had given him something important. He saw that even in the most tense moments, there are people who are ready to take his side. Mrs. Ellis was an example to him of how the power of one voice can change the course of events. Her intervention not only saved him from further accusations, but also helped break down the barriers that had been built around him based on stereotypes and distrust. Samuel understood that Mr. Baker was not an enemy, but rather a product of a society that too often imposed fear and distrust on others. His attempt to apologize was an important step, and Samuel took it as a sign that even the most established views might begin to change. However, Samuel couldn't ignore the fact that his neighbor had initially acted out of prejudice. It was a long road to real change, and Samuel knew that he would have to continue to struggle with similar situations, but now he was ready for it. This incident showed not only weaknesses, but also the strength of the human spirit. Samuel realized that sometimes, to change people's minds, you need to face up to injustice and show that everyone deserves respect. He managed to maintain his calm and dignity despite all the difficulties, and this gave him a new understanding of how he can resist bias. Samuel felt stronger as he went to bed. This evening taught him that even small steps can make a big difference, and that every day is an opportunity to change the perception of other people. He knew that this was just one of many episodes in his life, but he also realized that with each such incident, his confidence and desire for justice only increased. That night Samuel fell asleep with a sense of inner peace. Tomorrow was a new day, and he was ready to face it with renewed vigor, knowing that despite all the difficulties, there were people who would support him in his time of need, and that there was room for change in the world, even if it was slow. This evening was a milestone not only for Samuel, but for everyone in Primrose Street.